In 2016, a team of geneticists opened up ancient bones from caves across Europe, Russia, and the Caucasus Mountains, expecting to confirm what everyone already believed about the European bison. Instead, they found something that made no biological sense. The animal living in European forests right now, the one you can still go see in Poland today, was never supposed to exist. It was born from an event so rare that scientists on the project openly said it isn't really meant to happen in mammals. Two completely different animals separated by millions of years of evolution somehow crossed paths, and out of that impossible pairing came a brand new species that went on to outcompete both of its parents and become the largest land mammal in Europe. For over a century, biologists had a story about where this animal came from, and that story was wrong. Cave painters 10,000 years before the invention of writing had already recorded the truth on stone walls, and nobody understood what they were looking at until DNA finally caught up. This is the story of an animal that scientists nicknamed the Higgs bison, because like the Higgs boson in physics, everyone suspected it existed before anyone actually found the proof. Stick with me, because the ending of this story is happening right now, in real time in a forest on the border of Poland and Belarus, where every single bison alive today is being kept alive by a genetic trick that barely works. Let's start with the animal itself. The European bison, also called the Wisent, is Europe's heaviest living land animal. A big bull can weigh close to a metric ton, stand 2 meters at the shoulder, and still move through dense forest without making a sound. For most of the 20th century, biologists assumed this animal was a fairly simple evolutionary cousin of the American bison, just a European branch of the same family tree, shaped a bit differently by forest life instead of open plains. That assumption sat comfortably in textbooks for decades. Nobody had a strong reason to question it, mainly because nobody could find where the Wisent actually came from in the fossil record. And that absence turned out to be the first clue that something didn't add up. Here's the problem researchers kept running into. When you dig through Ice Age sediment layers across Europe, you find plenty of bones from the steppe bison, a shaggy, long-horned animal that roamed from Spain to Alaska during the Pleistocene. You find aurochs bones, the wild ancestor of modern cattle, an animal so large and aggressive that Julius Caesar wrote about hunters fearing it more than lions. What you do not find going back beyond about 12,000 years is a clear fossil lineage for the modern European bison. The Wisent essentially appears to pop into existence right around the end of the last ice age, with almost no ancestral trail behind it. For a species that supposedly evolved gradually like everything else, that is a strange kind of silence in the rock record. At the same time, a separate mystery was sitting inside French and Spanish cave art, and almost nobody connected the two puzzles until geneticists forced the issue. If you go through Ice Age cave paintings, particularly in sites like Chauvet-Pont d'Arc in France, you notice something odd. There are two visually distinct types of bison depicted by ancient artists. One type has long horns, a tall hump, and a build very close to the steppe bison. The other has a smaller hump, shorter horns, and a stockier frame, closer to what a modern Wisent looks like. For a long time, art historians assumed these were just stylistic differences, maybe different artists, different periods, different regional styles. Nobody seriously entertained the idea that Ice Age humans were painting two genuinely different animals that coexisted in the same landscape. It turns out they were right to paint them differently, because they were looking at two different species. In 2016, a team led by geneticist Julien Soubrier at the University of Adelaide, working with researcher Alan Cooper, decided to settle the question with hard data instead of guesswork. They pulled ancient mitochondrial genomes and nuclear DNA from 38 bison and cattle specimens, some more than 50,000 years old, recovered from caves across France, the North Sea region, the Ural Mountains, and the Caucasus. Their goal was simple on paper: build a family tree and figure out exactly where the modern Wisent branches off. What they got back from the lab was not a clean branch at all. It was a genetic collision. The DNA showed that a group of ancient specimens, which the team temporarily nicknamed Clade X, didn't fit neatly into either the steppe bison lineage or the aurochs lineage. Instead, this mystery group carried a genetic signature that was a blend of both. The mitochondrial DNA, which passes down only through the mother, pointed toward aurochs ancestry. But the nuclear DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents, was overwhelmingly bison. Put those two findings together, and you get an unmistakable signature of hybridization. At some point, male steppe bison and female aurochs interbred, and their offspring didn't just survive as isolated oddities. They formed a self-sustaining breeding population that carried traits from both species forward. The researchers calculated that this hybridization event happened more than 120,000 years ago, most likely during a warm interglacial period called the Eemian, when Europe's climate and habitats were shifting rapidly. And this is the detail that should genuinely surprise you if you know anything about mammal biology. Hybridization between two established species almost never produces a new, independently viable species in mammals. It happens constantly in plants. It happens in some fish and birds. In large mammals, it is exceptionally rare because the genetic distance between species usually creates infertile or unhealthy offspring. Think of a mule, which cannot reproduce. But the steppe bison and aurochs cross didn't just survive. Modern genome studies confirm the resulting animal carries up to 10% aurochs genomic ancestry alongside its dominant bison genome, and it went on to become an entirely new, self-perpetuating species. Alan Cooper, one of the study's co-authors, put it bluntly: the two parent animals were genetically quite different. Yet what came out of that pairing was successful enough to eventually become the largest surviving mammal species in Europe after the Ice Age extinctions ended. Now here is where the cave art mystery finally clicks into place. The team cross-referenced their radiocarbon dates with the timeline of cave paintings, and the match was almost eerie. Long-horned bison paintings resembling the steppe bison cluster in periods that align with steppe bison genetic dominance. Shorter horned, smaller humped bison paintings cluster in periods when the hybrid lineage, the ancestor of the modern Wisent, was ecologically dominant instead. Ice Age humans were not making stylistic choices. They were accurately recording two different animals switching dominance across the landscape as the climate swung back and forth thousands of years before anyone had a word for genetics. The researchers found evidence that these two lineages traded ecological dominance multiple times over tens of thousands of years, tracking major climate shifts until the steppe bison eventually went extinct at the end of the last ice age, and the hybrid lineage, our modern Wisent, became the sole survivor in Europe. So, to be clear about what this actually means, the European bison you can see today in a handful of forests in Poland, Belarus, Romania, and a few reintroduction sites across Europe is not simply an evolved version of an ancient bison lineage. It is the surviving descendant of a one-time genetic accident between two different genera of large mammal, an accident so improbable that researchers half-jokingly named it after a subatomic particle that took physicists decades to prove existed. It shouldn't have produced a viable new species. And yet here we are, more than 100,000 years later, and its descendants are still walking through Białowieża forest right now. But the story doesn't end with a triumphant reveal. It gets darker, and this next part is where most documentaries stop talking, but it might be the most important piece of the whole picture. This improbable hybrid species, the one that beat the odds by existing at all, nearly went extinct for real less than 100 years ago. And the way it survived created a genetic problem that conservationists are still fighting today. By 1919, the wild population of the lowland European bison, the Białowieża forest population, was completely wiped out. Hunting, habitat loss, and the chaos of the First World War finished off the last wild herd. The Caucasian subspecies held on a little longer in the mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas, but by 1927, poachers shot the last wild individual there too. For a brief window in history, the European bison, the animal that had survived 120,000 years, multiple ice ages, and the extinction of its own parent species, existed nowhere in the wild, anywhere on the entire planet. What saved it was a small number of animals scattered across European zoos and private reserves. When conservationists took stock of every European bison left alive anywhere on Earth in captivity, the entire future of the species came down to just 54 animals. And when they built a breeding program from that pool, the usable genetic founders for what became the modern population narrowed down even further to just 12 individuals. 12. Every European bison alive on the planet today, every single one you could go see in a forest reserve, descends from those 12 founding animals from roughly a century ago. That bottleneck did not distribute evenly either. Genetic studies of the official European bison pedigree book, a breeding record that has tracked over 15,000 individual animals since 1881, found that just one founding pair contributed a staggering 85% of the genetic makeup of one of the two surviving breeding lines. And here's a detail that tends to surprise people who assume genetic diversity just naturally works itself out over generations. Every single male in the purebred lowland line today carries a Y chromosome traced back to one single ancestral bull. One bull, roughly 100 years ago, is the paternal source for the Y chromosome of every male in that entire lineage alive right now. The consequences of that bottleneck are still playing out. Researchers studying the Białowieża population found that despite the visible wild population climbing back up toward 800 animals in that specific herd, the effective genetic population size, essentially a measure of true breeding diversity rather than raw head count, sat at only around 25. For context, conservation biologists generally consider 50 to be the minimum effective population size needed for a species to have a reasonable buffer against the immediate dangers of inbreeding and genetic drift. The European bison, even after decades of dedicated recovery work, was still sitting well under half of that safety threshold. Scientists studying the species have documented increased susceptibility to disease and reduced allelic diversity so severe that standard genetic testing tools used on most mammals don't even work properly on Wisent DNA anymore, because there simply isn't enough variation left to read. The recovery numbers are genuinely impressive on the surface. From those 54 captive survivors and 12 breeding founders, the global population has climbed past 9,000 animals, with more than 6,800 living wild or semi-wild across reintroduction sites in Poland, Belarus, Russia, Romania, Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain. The International Union for Conservation of Nature has upgraded the species from endangered to near threatened, which is a real conservation success story by almost any measure. But every one of those 9,000 animals is, genetically speaking, closely related to every other one. It is a species that was rebuilt from a genetic pool smaller than a single school classroom. And that ceiling doesn't disappear just because the population number goes up. Conservationists studying the herds today have been direct about the limits of what more breeding management can even accomplish, since there are no genetically distinct, unrelated animals left anywhere to reintroduce into the gene pool. Every bison alive is already related to every other bison alive. So think about what that actually means, side by side. This is an animal that owes its very existence to one of the rarest events possible in mammalian evolution. A successful hybrid speciation event that created something durable enough to outlive both of its parent species and every ice age that followed. And then, roughly 120,000 years later, that same improbable survivor was reduced to 12 individuals by human hunting in the span of a single human lifetime. And every bison walking through a European forest today carries the genetic fingerprint of that narrow escape. It is one of the strangest full circle stories in modern conservation biology. A species that technically should never have existed in the first place, nearly erased, then rebuilt from a genetic thread so thin that scientists still consider its long-term survival an open question. The next time you see a photo of a European bison standing in the mist at Białowieża Forest, you're not just looking at an old world cousin of the American buffalo. You're looking at the last living evidence of a hybridization event that shouldn't have worked, that ancient humans recorded on cave walls without understanding what they were drawing. And that came within a hair's breadth of disappearing completely less than a century ago. Its entire existence, both the ancient origin and the modern survival, comes down to genetics beating odds that, by every normal rule of evolution, it should not have beaten. If you found this as strange and fascinating as I did, there's a whole world of species out there, hiding origin stories just like this one. Animals we assumed we understood completely until DNA proved otherwise. Let me know in the comments which mystery you want unpacked next.